All right, so to get started. All right, oh, sorry. So to get started, I have to well, I click on this first. Okay. So to get started again, I wanted to take you to Hoyabach, which is a municipality in the department of El Quiche in Guatemala. And this is just outside of Hoyabach. So it's kind of a rural area. It's one of the areas that was intensely affected by the Civil War there. And there's also a town center just beyond those hills. And I want to start with the story of Jorge. So as I described in the chapter that was circulated, Jorge was a shopkeeper in Hoyabach around the time that I was doing my field work there. And he was actually sort of trying to help people out in the community. There was a family that was very impoverished, even by standards there. And they were living in sort of a tent-like structure near Jorge's store. And they didn't have a bathroom. So Jorge said, yeah, you guys can come in and use the bathroom in the store anytime. And they did. They would come and go, come and go. One day, one of the younger daughters of this family, her genital area became inflamed. And she didn't really articulate what had happened or why, but her family naturally thought that Jorge must have sexually assaulted her. That was the conclusion that they reached. And so they actually did make a police report. There's a police station there. The police did investigate. They took her for a forensic medical exam. The report from the exam said infection, no evidence of trauma. But people didn't believe that. And so rumors circulated. People grew more and more certain that definitely Jorge did it, definitely a crime had been committed, and he was certainly guilty, beyond any shadow of a doubt. And so one day people took action. So a group of men, including the girl's father, but not exclusively her relatives, got together, caught Jorge, dragged him through various locations in town, beating him, tying him up to different locations. And then finally, they ended up in the center of town, where there's this big tree trunk. And so in Hoyabach, the tree trunk is not always up there. It's actually, I'll change over here. So it actually gets put up around the time of the town's festivals. It's used for a traditional dance, called, I guess in English, like the flying pole dance. And it's called the palo volador. And usually, I mean, it is used for death-defying things. So the dancers climb up to the top, they tie themselves on, they come spiraling down. Some of them come down seated, some of them come down dangling by their legs. But on this particular day, it was Jorge whose life was in danger. Because when the crowd got to the palo volador, they tied him up to it, they continued beating him, more and more people came. They started calling for gasoline, which in Guatemala means that somebody's getting lynched, because one of the practices that's typically used in lynching in Guatemala is burning people. And his life was hanging in the balance when the Catholic priest assigned to the town and the mayor actually intervened and came out, talked to some of the main instigators, and convinced them to give Jorge over to the police. So this is not the same day. This is a photo from a different day in town, a calmer day. But the police were waiting right on the outskirts of the area. And so the crowd did give Jorge over to them, but with the understanding that he was going to get arrested for the crime he'd allegedly committed. Instead, what the police did is took him off to the department capital for medical attention and took him into protective custody. So when word got back to Hoyabach that he wasn't arrested, in fact, he was off to the hospital getting medical care, and then he was going to be let go. Again, the consensus was clear among people that I'd interviewed and spoken with and just on the street that if he came back, he was a dead man. So stories like this happen often in Guatemala, and in some ways, Jorge's fate is only interesting because he survived. It's only unique because he survived and kind of remarkable. We might say that this was an event that was really overdetermined. It's a place that's had lynchings before. In Guatemala, there's something you often see in the media, or just kind of a common framing. I want to be clear that I don't think it has any actual real basis, but you often see the framing that lynching is my injustice. This is a majority indigenous town. You might say it was overdetermined. But I actually think that this event, like most instances of vigilantism, is really puzzling. And it illustrates several puzzles of vigilantism. So what are some of those puzzles? So first, why use these particular types of violence? Why do something that is such an intimate form of violence? In fact, most of the people that were involved in that incident own firearms. If they actually wanted to kill Jorge, why not just shoot him and be done with it? Why, go through something that was very costly to them and to some extent risky to them as well? Why were the main instigators of this event not indigenous? So again, if we're looking at things in an aggregate sense, yeah, this is a municipality that's about 90% indigenous. The key instigators and ringleaders, not indigenous in this scenario, raises a lot of questions about the idea that this is kind of traditional justice. Why would lynching happen in a very low crime municipality? So, if we look at a map of, to the extent that they're measured, crime rates across Guatemala, certainly homicide rates, this is actually one of the safest places around in the country. So if we think that vigilance is responding to a crisis of insecurity, I'm not sure that there really was one. And why did this group of people end up seeking out the state in what they were doing? So they had caught Jorge in another location. And this is very common in lynchings in Guatemala, that somebody gets detained somewhere else and then intentionally brought to a very central location. And not just any old crossing of streets or a place where people gather, but usually a location that is directly facing government buildings. So they sought out publicity, they sought out engagement with the state, and then actually ended up being involved very much in a back and forth and in a negotiation with the state, which is very different than how we often think of vigilantism. People think of it as something that happens in the absence of the state, or as a complete rejection of the state. All right, so to start understanding some of those puzzles, I think that we need two things. We need a definition of vigilantism, but we also need a theoretical framework for understanding vigilantism. Just really quickly, I wanted to mention that when it comes to the definition, I've got you covered. So I wrote a paper before that's largely a definitional paper and a conceptual paper, which is this one. And I define vigilantism as the extralegal prevention, investigation, or punishment of offenses. Now, there are other definitions out there. There's a whole interesting conversation we could have about this. For the purposes of this project, I'm basically going to grab onto this one and run with it. CPS took it and liked it. Apparently, Wikipedia has adopted it now, or so I've heard. So we'll go with this. But it's still not enough to figure out what's really going on here. So in terms of theoretical framework, how do people often approach the study of vigilantism? So I think that there are two dominant ways that vigilantism is often understood or approached. The first is through a functional lens. And you see this a lot in accounts from vigilantes themselves, media reports, and to some extent academic work. What does this mean? This means the idea that vigilantism is responding to some kind of problem. Problem is exactly, there's a lot of different nuances there. Is it a problem of state absence? Is it a problem of state illegitimacy? Is it a problem of high crime rates? Is it a problem of sort of distrust in police or police non-responsiveness? But the framing or the lens here is, the idea is there's a problem, vigilantes are there to solve it. And so it's a very kind of functional, reactive understanding of vigilantism. The other common framing is of vigilantism as popular justice, doing the people's will, some sort of expression of the people's will. And this one kind of has two subtypes, so subvariants. In some settings, and kind of depending on the history of the place, sometimes you get arguments that are very cultural. So like I was saying about the notion of justicia maya in Guatemala. Other times, and I think more commonly and more universally, you get statements by vigilantes or by people writing about them saying they're doing what the people wanted. The people need this, they're acting on behalf of the people, it's the people's will. Now, I'll say that there are a couple other really wonderful scholars that work on vigilantism that have a somewhat different take, actually a significantly different take than what I just described. And so I wanted to flag these three books as books that I recommend you have a look at and that I think very highly of. So and I'm much more sympathetic to the approaches here. So Eduardo Moncada, in his excellent recent book, he tends to frame vigilantism as a form of resistance, a way of resisting predation, and looks at it through a lens of political economy, largely. Meanwhile, Leon Fuji's posthumously published book, she really understands vigilantism along with other forms of sort of public performative violence through the metaphor of casting. And I think it's a really important work that I recommend folks look at as well. And then Nick Smith's book about South Africa, he frames vigilantism as a critique of the state, which again, I think a lot of these things are very compatible with what I'm about to share with you. And I'm really grateful to all of them for their work that I think is still forward. All right, so in my book project, this is the puzzle and the set of circumstances that I'm trying to address. That we have a puzzling phenomenon, we have a definition, but I think we need a theoretical framework that's going to help us better understand when, how, and where, and why vigilantism is happening. So this is the structure of the project, which is laid out a bit more in the materials that I sent. And I just wanted to say quickly that it'd be very challenging to try to present this all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on several parts of the project and share them with you in a little bit more detail. So one area that I'm going to talk a lot more about is the connection between public opinion and vigilantism. So that discussion comes kind of early in the project, where I'm calling into question the intuitive idea that vigilantism is popular justice. I'm going to say a little bit, there's only a very tiny bit in the talk, but a little bit about how we can use the framework of contentious politics to, I think, understand vigilantism in a more multidimensional and productive way. And then I'm going to provide a really brief example that shows us how that framework and looking at vigilantism as a form of contentious politics can help us understand the relations that exist between vigilantes and states. Okay, so to start talking about this idea of popular justice, that sign came out really large on the screen. But this is a sign from Cuiabá, and it is a little smaller in real life. But I wanted to put it up here because this is one of the signs that the security committee there, security patrol there, makes for itself. So they're called the Guardians of the Neighborhood, is their name at the top there. And one of the things I think is interesting about this sign is that in the background there, in the light type, what they're saying is, we're alert 24 hours a day because we love our town. And you often see this kind of language from vigilante groups, from people that are engaged in vigilantism, asserting that they're working on behalf of the good of all, of course, and just as the people would want them to. But it's worth asking, is this actually what people want to have happening in their communities? Especially because there's a lot of reasons to think that vigilantism is an inherently undemocratic practice. You've got people using violence who are coercive, who are exercising power over others, often drawing on existing hierarchies. Do we really think that they would change their behavior because there was a majority vote the other way in their town? I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. And in fact, it is interesting to take a look at what public opinion data tells us about vigilantism. So it's a little bit tricky because there's not a lot of excellent public opinion data about what people think. I've actually had an RA recently scouring the world to see what polls and what surveys have been done about people's attitudes toward vigilantism in different settings. And they're usually very ad hoc surveys when they've been done, like maybe there was a specific incident in a specific city, and then one survey is commissioned with one question at one moment in time there. However, there is one really nice cross-national source of data that we can take a look at, which is from the Americans Barometer, one of my favorite sources of quantitative data and one of my favorite surveys. So in 2014, they asked a question on their Pan-American survey, asking whether or not the respondents, or to what degree the respondents agreed or disagreed with people taking the law into their own hands when the government does not punish criminals. There's some issues with this question, as with any question on vigilantism, especially the when the government does not punish criminals part at the end, which is kind of framing the question in a particular way and setting up a set of circumstances that maybe don't exist everywhere. But this is what we've got. And it was also, I should mention, it was asked on a 1 to 10 scale to start with. So people were given a little stair-step graphic. It said, you know, put yourself on this graphic. How much do you agree or disagree? And so in what I'm going to show you, I coded somebody who's 7 or above on that 10-point scale as saying that they agree. My logic here was that if somebody chooses 5, they're definitely wishy-washy, like they're definitely in the middle. 6 is kind of close to 5, so they might be leaning. And so I tried to be kind of conservative, I guess, in picking 7 as, if you're 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, you're agreeing with the statement. But basic trends I'm going to show you don't really change if we pick like 8 or something instead. Okay, so here's how that looks across the Americas. And so I'll also add the caveat, of course, there should be little error bars on all of these that are like plus or minus approximately 2 percentage points. These are national estimates for each of these countries, but just for simplicity, they're listed as points here. Okay, so what does this tell us? The percentage of people that you get agreeing with the idea of vigilantism varies pretty widely. Down on the low end, there's Panama, Chile, Venezuela. Up on the high end, there's El Salvador, Honduras, Paraguay, Dominican Republic. A couple things really jump out to me about this. So one of the first is that some of the heavy hitters of vigilantism in Latin America are kind of in the mushy middle on this. That's a little bit surprising. So you've got Bolivia, Guatemala. Given that I currently live in Canada, I was kind of struck that Canada comes out with the same percentage of people agreeing as in Haiti or in Colombia. I didn't put the US on here because the other data that I'm going to show you in a minute was not recorded for the US as well. But if you're curious, the US came out almost the same as Canada, at least in 2014, or maybe a little bit lower actually. They came out at like 16. So it was somewhere around here, like 16, 17% of people in the US agreed with that statement. All right, so this to me raises some questions to start with. But then we can try to combine that with some cross-national data about where different types of vigilantism happen. As you might imagine, trying to measure vigilantism and its occurrence cross-nationally would be a huge challenge. And it is not something that I've attempted to do myself. Instead, I'm kind of like using the data from a few other people here. So this is another book that I would recommend that's by Danielle Jung and Derek K. Cohen from Emory and from Harvard, respectively. And for their book project, they created a cross-national data set of lynching. The way they went about this is that they, with RAs, read State Department human rights reports, for particular countries in particular years, and then coded whether or not lynching was mentioned, at all. Was it mentioned at all? Was it mentioned as sporadic? Was it mentioned as, massive and widespread? And so they had a multi-level measure of intensity. How much is it mentioned? So that's the way this is coded. And if we compare what they found with the public opinion data, it doesn't really match up. So there's some places where you have very high stated public support for vigilantism, not a lot of lynching getting recorded. You've got other places where there's quite a bit happening, not much public support that's recorded. So I thought this was interesting. But you might say, well, their data's from 1978 to 2018. Would we really think that things that were happening in the 1970s would show up in public opinion data today? So I did look at this separately as well, just for the post-2010 time period. And again, it's kind of a mixed bag. And to be clear, the places that are listed of no incidents here, it's not that the data is missing, it's that they had a recorded value of 0. All right, but it's also good to look at other sources. So there's this other new resource that's available just recently out of ETH Zurich from SEO and Clayton. And working with research assistants, they've created this website that you can visit and a data set that you can download if you want. It's free, it's available to you if you want to use it for your research. And so basically they've coded based on newspaper accounts, based on media accounts, specific instances of lynching across Latin America in the 2010 to 2019 time period. So I also went and took a look at their data to see how does that match up with what we know about public opinion. So they look at a different set of countries. So this is again the lockup data, but for a more restricted set of countries. And again, I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. And one thing that I think is interesting is that the way their coding comes out is pretty different actually than the Jung and Cohen. So there are countries that reported nothing, or at least where lynching was not picked up as a significant problem in these State Department reports, the prior data set, but they decoded actually as pretty high values here. So like Chile really jumps out to me. Panama was 0 in the other data set. Here it's, kind of middle of the pack. Guatemala is the big winner in both measures. But besides that, there's a lot of variation actually between the two sources and not much clear relationship with public opinion. Still, you might say to me, oh, but Gina, these are national public opinion measures. Surely what must be happening is that at the subnational level, these events are only happening some places, and that's where people agree with it. You could have a situation in Guatemala where half the country, has these views, half don't. All the lynchings are happening in one place, and maybe people's, the supporters are concentrated there. So just to start to get at that, we don't have a perfect answer to that issue. But I wanted to show you a little bit about how public opinion maps onto where lynchings tend to happen in Guatemala. So this map, one caveat is that it's not controlling, in this version that I'm showing you, it's not controlling for population. This is just number of instances back in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. But in that logbook data that I've been mentioning, it is broken down by region. And they originally used the regions in Guatemala as their sampling strata. So the standard errors on these estimates of public opinion get much bigger because there's only several hundred people per region that they sampled. So that's why there's a little confidence interval under here. But you can look at this by region. So Northwest, the Western Highlands of Guatemala is where Cuernavaca is, where a lot of lynching is concentrated. And you get 17% of the people that they surveyed there responding yes to this question. In the Northeast, which because there's low population density, it doesn't really look like it on this map, but it's also a place where a lot of lynching happens. You get 7% saying yes to the question. Then you've got the capital. So in the capital, about 31% approved. And the region that I think is really interesting is over here, what's classified as the South, which is an area where lynchings are quite rare, right? Really don't happen. Sometimes there are other more private forms of vigilantism, what I would call more individualistic or family-based forms of vigilantism, what Eduardo Moncada would call like piecemeal vigilantism, that does happen in this area, but not lynchings, not these big public events. And you've got a very large percentage of people, relative to the areas that have more lynchings that are approving of vigilantism over there. And just to show you some of those geographic trends in a different way, I wanted to also just bring up, this is a different way of looking at spatial data there, but at one point I had done a kind of hot spot and cold spot analysis of patterns of lynchings in Guatemala, just to see where are there concentrated areas that lynching tends to occur more often than average or less often than average. And consistent with all the other data that's out there, it's really the Western Highlands and to some extent the northeastern part of the country, which are not places that have extraordinarily high levels of public support for vigilantism. And to some extent, maybe this is not surprising. They're saying vigilantism is a very undemocratic practice anyhow. But I think this issue of public opinion is a really important one to flag for a couple reasons. So on a policy level, so this is an actual poster that I ran across once in Cuernavaca. Some graphic designer has, very creatively showed what some of the key elements of a lynching in Guatemala, and then put the big "no, don't do this" / symbol over it. And so this poster is basically telling people, no to lynching. Lynching dishonors those who practice it. Don't participate in this criminal act. It is a crime. Resolve conflicts in a peaceful way. Respect the law. Respect life. And you see a lot of public outreach campaigns like this. I have to wonder, though, if we don't think that changing those public opinion numbers by even 5 percentage points or 10 percentage points would make a direct impact on the occurrence of things like lynchings, you have to wonder about the effectiveness of campaigns like this. And from a research point of view, a lot of the research that you'll see on vigilantism is actually about attitudes toward vigilantism. So if you look carefully, and I get sent a lot of these articles to review, you probably see them too, out, getting published and out in the world. If you look carefully at a lot of studies about vigilantism, especially any kind of survey experiment, things that involve a survey, really, to measure the dependent variable, it's usually asking people, do you approve? Do you disapprove? Would you be more likely to do this? Would you be less likely to do this? I think that there are valid reasons to study people's attitudes towards something like lynching or like vigilantism unto themselves. But I think we have to be really careful about making a leap from saying, well, this intervention is changing public opinion or changing people's responses to the survey in a certain way. That's going to change people's behavior on this issue in the world. So I don't think that the link between public opinion and actual behavior is very clear at all. So this is just one example of the ways that I think looking at vigilantism, either as functional, which we didn't talk about as much, or as just this expression of public will and of public opinion, they can be misleading. So what do I think is a better framework? Enter contentious politics. So this is my attempts at sort of reproducing one of the figures from the second edition of Contentious Politics by Tilley and Tarot. And I think that this is a very helpful way of thinking about vigilantism and trying to understand it. So the three components here are, contention. So, making claims that affect someone else's interests, definitely happening, always happening when you've got instances of vigilantism. The politics part, the government, as I'll argue later in the talk, the government is one of the audiences for vigilantism generally. There's points being communicated. People are also in contravention, of the stated laws where they are. If they're engaged in vigilantism to start with, it's always extra legal. So either implicitly or explicitly, there's engagement with the state, engagement with the formal political process as well. Then we get to collective action. So I do think that vigilantism ranges on a spectrum from being totally individual to very collective. But in practice, the vast majority of the vigilantism that gets observed and happens in the world involves at least small groups of people. So the true Lone Ranger that's not instructed by anyone, not in communication with anyone else, very, very unusual. Even in a more private or individualistic or piecemeal sort of vigilantism, there's groups, there's cells, there's people who maybe are 5 people, 10 people, who might be operating in a more clandestine way, but they're still coordinating. And they're still facing choices about how many other people do we involve? Do we have the capacity to recruit them? Do we have the capacity to manage them? So I think that there is variation in the extent to which vigilantism is collective, but a lot of the most impactful forms of vigilantism that people are concerned about and the ones that really have a public impact tend to be more collective. So this is an area where I think, if there could be some debate about the extent to which vigilantism is collective, but I think that looking at it as a form of collective action makes a lot of sense in a lot of the instances. So what does this do for us? I think that applying this framework lets us start to ask questions about the repertoires of tactics that people are using in vigilantism. One of the puzzles that we're not going to be able to talk about as much today, but one of the puzzles that's addressed in the project is, why is it that in vigilantism the punishment doesn't fit the crime? You very often see, and this actually comes out of that lynching in Latin America data set I was showing you, the codes, the causes. You very often see instances of vigilantism precipitated by minor property crime, like theft. And then you see a reaction that seems very disproportionate. And if you're looking at this through, say, the functional lens, that's hard to understand. But I think that if we're looking at this through the lens of repertoires and practices and, sort of pushing to look at the skills that people bring to an organization, how they're learning from prior experiences, and if we look at it from the perspective that, people's actions are not just a functional strategy, but are shaped by those influences, then it starts to make a little bit more sense, why you see some of these practices. So that's the whole chapter of the project. Now, you might think, well, some vigilantism looks like collective action, some of it doesn't. Some of it looks like what we think of as contentious politics, some of it doesn't. So I wanted to give you, just starting to wrap up a bit, 2 examples two cases that happened in Canada, actually. One of which looks, I think, a lot like contentious politics, and the other of which doesn't. But I would argue that this framework still is helpful for understanding both of them. Okay, so over here, we've got an aerial view of Ottawa last February, and it's very snowy there. It's even snowier there right now. This also happens to be like 4 or 5 blocks away from where I live, actually. And you might have heard last year that Ottawa got occupied. So we got occupied by this group of people called the Freedom Convoy, also known as the truckers. They're not actually truckers, a lot of them, but that's kind of how they're popularly known. So the downtown area of Ottawa got completely taken over. This was an area, it's like a kilometer to 1.5 kilometers long and half a kilometer deep or so. I mean, this is a pretty substantial area. There was just an absolute red zone. It was called the red zone, actually. No-go area. But even beyond the red zone, though, like in the area where I live and in kind of surrounding residential areas, people were very affected by this. So large trucks, coming down neighborhood streets at all hours of the day, offensive language, people yelling offensive things, people showing up at schools and threatening children, people flooding the 911 system to the point that the 911 system stopped working, a lot of aggressive and harassing behavior, some damage to property, some threats toward people, some sort of assaults and scuffles reported. And after weeks and weeks and weeks of this, people started to get very frustrated. And so the local dog walking group in our neighborhood, which I'm not part of, I don't have a dog, but the dog walkers were like, enough, we're done. So they got organized. And so folks over here, right here, are the dog walkers. And then this is a whole bunch of vehicles that were trying to go into downtown that day to join the convoy demonstration, which had already been going on for weeks. It was an occupation by then. And they just decided, we're gonna go stop the trucks. They're not going through. They're not going to downtown. The end. And so in what I think was an extremely high risk choice, they just went out there, stood in the street, and blocked all these vehicles. That was like the route that, in this area, they actually couldn't get out the back based on the way this area was selected to do this action. So they ended up with a situation where they trapped, it was about 20 vehicles, like 20 kind of small and medium-sized trucks that all had occupants in them. A lot of them had supplies that they were trying to take to downtown, particularly fuel. If you saw the bouncy castles and all the other things that were down there, that was all being run off generators. They were bringing a lot of fuel in. And I'm not sure what the plan was, or if they thought they were really going to like catch this many people, but they did. They ended up with a set of convoy members kind of detained. So what ultimately ended up happening, to me this looks a lot like contentious politics, like what we think of. What ended up happening was that this sort of turned into a protest where hundreds more people came and brought their signs and then were surrounding the vehicles that had all these people in them. And then there was a whole debate about like, should we let the vehicles go? Should we let them just drive off? People definitely decided they did not want to let the vehicles go. I'm not sure if they would have let people walk off as pedestrians. I think they might have let them if they had tried, but nobody tried that course of action. But what this group of people did end up doing is they did end up deciding to seize the fuel. And at that point, I would call it a little bit of vigilantism on top of this sort of protest action. Because the police were there, like 10 police got sent over well after this started. The police were completely outnumbered. And people were not going to let vehicles go with nothing happening to them. So the crowd kind of decided that the appropriate punishment would be to be removed of all their insignia and the fuel in particular, and to keep the fuel. And so there was kind of this illegal seizure of the fuel, and then the vehicles and their occupants did leave. So what ended up happening? I think this was actually a very impactful event because since then there's been inquiries into the government's response to the occupation. And it was really striking to me that when Justin Trudeau was testifying, he mentioned this particular incident multiple times. The fact that these people were out there and the fact that they essentially detained these people and then took their belongings from them seems to have had a very strong impact on the federal government's decision that they had to take some kind of action to end the occupation. And So I think that to me, this is an example of the ways that, vigilantism has its immediate target, which is, I guess, in this case, the people in the pickup trucks. But the state was also an audience for what they were doing. And they were pretty successful, I think, in communicating that point. So in the chapter about the state that I didn't get to share with you guys, I got a different part. But what I talk about is the role of the state in instances of vigilantism. We often think of vigilantism as happening completely outside the state, in a place where the state is absent or totally ineffective. Actually, the state participates in lots of different ways, either through its institutions or through state-affiliated actors. The state can be the target. In Guatemala and other places, sometimes it's not uncommon that like actual police are targeted and are the ones accused of something who are then brought to be lynched, or people attack police stations to get back a suspect, for example. The state can be a perpetrator. In the chapter, I branch out more into collusion, acquiescence, various different degrees and shades of participation, but the state can be on the participating side. And the state can also be an audience. And to me, I think this is something that a contentious politics perspective helps us to see more clearly in instances of vigilantism. And even in settings where you don't have vigilantism kind of layered on top of a protest or in such a political setting, I think that it still does communicate a message to the state. So I have one other example here for you from Toronto. So this is the example of David Chen, who is pictured there shaking hands with Stephen Harper, who was then the Prime Minister of Canada, in his market, in the Lucky Moose food market in Toronto. How did this picture come about? Which is, that's what you see every day. Well, previously, in 2009, there had been a plant thief, somebody who routinely came to David's market to steal plants. And one day the plant thief came back and David said, enough. He got some of his coworkers. So again, a little bit of organizing, a little bit of collective action here. They chased down the plant thief. They actually ended up chasing him in a vehicle, like he was on foot. They threw him in the back of their vehicle. They tied him up. They brought him back to the store. Then they kept him kind of imprisoned and tied up there. And other people had called the police by then because they saw somebody getting thrown into the back of a van in downtown Toronto, thought he was getting kidnapped. So the police show up on the scene pretty quickly and they arrest everybody involved. They arrest the plant thief for stealing plants. They arrest David and his coworkers for, I think, he had a lot of charges. It was like abduction, unlawful imprisonment, beating the guy a little bit, some assault thrown in there, lots of charges. And David actually gets prosecuted. But in the course of those events unfolding, he makes political connections that he never could have dreamed of. So many different local politicians come by the store. Public sentiment seemed, as far as anyone could tell, seemed to be on, David's side. And so politicians start turning up on a regular basis, and up to and including eventually the Prime Minister of Canada. And Canada actually passed a piece of federal legislation inspired by David's experience, letting, explicitly permitting a wider range of measures to be used in citizens' arrests without a risk that the person can get prosecuted. So I think this was actually a case where that type of sort of assertive, combative action had a really strong impact, and again, had an impact on the state, even though maybe that wasn't the intended audience from the beginning. Okay, so to circle back, there's a lot of other parts of the project as well that I'd be happy to talk to you about in the Q&A or separately, but these were the areas that I wanted to zoom in on for you here today. So I hope it's been helpful, and if you have any questions or comments, definitely feel free to